The Slavic languages, such as Russian, Ukrainian, Polish, Czech and Croatian, and the Germanic languages, including English, German, Dutch, Swedish and Gothic, are all distantly related via the ancient proto-indo-european language. As such, we can trace a number of words between them and link them back to the ancestral language. The two branches split off around the change of the 3rd and 4th millennia BC, so have had plenty of time to diversify. But let's say we take a look at just a small set of stable words. And let's also just focus on the proto-Germanic and proto-Slavic languages. These were the stages of the families before they began to split into the various daughters, and are therefore ancestral to all surviving members of the groups. Proto-Germanic was spoken in northern Germany and southern Scandinavia over a period of about 700 years, between 500 BC and 200 AD. Proto-Slavic is a very broad term, referring to all the varieties spoken between the 2nd millennium BC and about 600 AD in modern Ukraine and Poland. This video will focus mainly on the form of the language used later on, just before the dialects began to split up into the ancestors of today's languages. So, if we take these two languages as our endpoints, and let's use the numbers 1 to 10 as our basic word set, we can begin working through. And to make this a little easier, we have my friend and Slavic language expert RozumRazum here to provide his knowledge and help explain some of the Slavic side of things.
Hi there.
So I think we'll start at 1 and work our way through the numbers, looking at anything interesting on the way. Sound like a plan?
Sounds good to me.
So, the Proto-Indo-European word for 1 is oinos. In the evolution of Proto-Germanic, we see the loss of that initial laryngeal, represented by the H1. Before a vowel, it just disappears without a trace. We also see the O's turn into A's, and the final S turn into Z by Werner's law.
Werner's law? What's that?
Werner's law is a sound shift in Proto-Germanic, where the voiceless fricatives became voiced after an unaccented vowel or vowel sonorant sequence. It applied after the famous Grimm's law, where Proto-Indo-European stops chain-shifted into fricatives.
Is this like the word apple? In Proto-Slavic, the word for apple was ablako, from a Proto-Indo-European rebol, where both have a B. But I've noticed that in English it uses a P. Is that from Grimm's law?
Yeah, just like that. In our case, the S that's being affected doesn't come from Grimm's. It was an original feature of Proto-Indo-European, but it was affected by Werner's law nonetheless. These shifts together give the Proto-Germanic form oinos.
Makes sense. I can see the similarity to the Proto-Indo-European word.
Yeah, it's a pretty straightforward one. So what about in Slavic?
The Proto-Slavic word was jedyne.
Wait, what? That looks nothing like the Proto-Indo-European. How did that happen?
Well, this word is actually made of 2 bits. The second, jine, was actually a word in Proto-Slavic. It had just undergone a shift in its meaning to the other one or another. It's still used with this meaning in several Slavic languages.
That makes sense. So the new compounded word derived from this took over the original meaning?
Exactly. What you have before the main root, ed, is some kind of emphatic morpheme that we find only in a very small number of Slavic words.
So, in the smaller root, there's a y at the start of the word, but that disappears in the longer form. What's happening there?
Well noticed. At the core of Proto-Slavic is a strong tendency to have words made up of open syllables that start with a consonant and end with a vowel. It's something described by the so-called law of open syllables. Originally, both our words started with a vowel, e and e. The y in the beginning of the words was the way to resolve that by inserting a fairly weak consonant and creating a consonant-vowel syllable.
I see. So forms without the consonant are actually older, but it was then added to make words more consistent. If Proto-Slavic preferred open syllables, is that why the final consonant of the word disappeared as well?
It is, yes. In Proto-Balto-Slavic, the ancestor of both Proto-Slavic and the Baltic languages, like Lithuanian and Latvian, Indo-European O and A merged together.
Like in Germanic?
Almost. In Germanic, you ended up with a short A and a long O. In Slavic, the earlier short A became O, giving us the opposite of what you had. The O of the noun ending stayed only in neuter words. In masculine words, it changed into the back year we see in jedyne. Just a note of precision, the back and the front years are hardly audible ultra-short vowels of Proto-Slavic. We'll meet them a few times in this video.
So, lastly, how did the I come about as the main vowel of the word?
It's hard to say. Indo-European oi usually gave Slavic ye. There are a few cases where it became e, but this doesn't seem particularly certain here. Some evidence suggests an original form ignos, but this doesn't agree very well with other branches, so it's a little unclear. Alright, what about number 2?
Well, the proto-indo-European word was dwo, which gave the proto-Germanic twi. Here we directly see the effects of Grimm's law, with the D turning into a T. A laryngeal after a vowel like this would normally lengthen the vowel. A long O later became a long A, but shifted back to O in Proto-Germanic.
So why does it end in I?
This is believed to be an influence from an adjective ending. In Proto-Germanic, strong masculine adjectives changed their nominative singular ending os, as in rodos, meaning good, to a plural I, giving us rodai. It's probably this ending that was lent to the numeral.
In Proto-Slavic, the word was dva, so you can see there's no Grimm's law in Slavic. The O ending that we see in the proto-indo-European is in fact a dual ending. Dual is a number used specifically to describe two things and was one of the 3 Indo-European numbers for which nouns and pronouns could inflect, along with the nowadays more common singular and plural. Most modern descendants have lost it, but it still survives in a couple of Slavic languages, like Slovene and Sorbian.
A lot of Old Germanic languages had it too. In Old English we had dual pronouns, and some forms survive in 1 or 2 Germanic dialects, but it's basically gone. So what happened to the dual in the Slavic word for two?
It's like in Germanic. The H1 disappeared, lengthening the vowel before it. As I've mentioned, a long O became A in Slavic, which is what we see here. A is a typical ending for the dual of masculine words in Proto-Slavic.
What about that U in the first syllable?
The back here is the typical evolution from the proto-indo-European U. This might have been epenthetic, or part of the original Indo-European word. Different branches reflect different words. We've seen that Germanic doesn't seem to have a vowel here, but Albanian, Greek and possibly Italic all agree with the Balto-Slavic. Finally, we see the W of our word turns into a V in Proto-Slavic, after the Balto-Slavic era. So moving on, the word for 3 was trejes, right?
Yes, it gave Proto-Germanic threes. And it's another great example of Grimm's law. This time we see the voiceless stop become a voiceless fricative, th. We also see the S turn into a Z, like in the number 1 earlier.
And those vowels just simplified to a long E?
Essentially, yes. It actually went through a few stages for unstressed E's and monophthongization, but the overall idea is exactly that. So how about in Slavic? As I understand, it's quite a simple one, right?
Pretty much, yes. The Proto-Slavic was trije. I won't dwell on it too much. Once again, you can see the Indo-European ending in s wasn't preserved in Slavic. We also see a vowel change in the first syllable, possibly by analogy with another word, but it's possibly just a sporadic change. The Proto-Slavic numeral for 4 is much more interesting. most branches of Indo-European can be classified as either centum or satem. This is to do with how they treated proto-Indo-Europeans' velar consonants. In centum branches, the so-called palatovelars merged with the plain velars, while in satem languages, the labiovelars were the ones to merge. Balto-Slavic is a satem branch, while Germanic is a centum branch. So, in our word for four, the initial qu became k. This is still the case in Baltic languages such as Lithuanian, their word for four being keturi. But in Proto-Slavic, something else happened. The palatalization of velar consonants, what we call the first palatalization. Palatalization occurs when a velar consonant, pronounced in the back of the mouth, comes into contact with a front vowel, making the velar consonant move forwards. In this case, we have a shift from k to ch before e. From the original Proto-Indo-European word, the wo irregularly became a long u in Proto-Balto-Slavic. This is then regularly fronted to l in Slavic, which is represented with the letter y.
Then we see loss of word final s again.
Exactly. So, what was the Proto-Germanic?
Fedwar.
Alright, parts of that sound like the Proto-Indo-European. I assume Grimm's law is to blame for the dissimilarities?
In part, yeah. So, firstly, the Germanic word descends from the neuter form of the Proto-Indo-European, so quetwar rather than quetwores. The second major point is that the initial qu turned into a p. This was under the influence of the word for five, which, as we'll see in a minute, began with a P, so four was made more similar to it, hence why the modern English 4 and 5 both begin with an F. That gave a pre-Proto-Germanic form of pedwar, from which Grimm's and Werner's laws were able to operate to create the word we saw earlier.
So you say the word for five began with p as well?
Yes, the Proto-Indo-European was benque, which gave the Proto-Germanic word fimf. In the word for, the qu assimilated to p. Well, the same thing happens in the word for five. In Proto-Germanic, that labialized velar stop assimilated to the initial bilabial. The nasal then also assimilated, giving an early form, pempe. From here, short, low and mid vowels were lost word finally, and Grimm's law took effect. Finally, an e was raised to e before a syllable final nasal, giving us the Proto-Germanic form.
In Slavic, something a bit different happens with the numbers 5 to 10. Rather than descending straight from the cardinal, these numbers evolved from the earlier ordinals, so the Slavic word for 5 descends from the Indo-European word for fifth, 6 comes from sixth, 7 from 7th, and so on. The Proto-Indo-European for fifth was penktos. After satemization and change of o to a, we get the form in Proto-Balto-Slavic, which was penktas. Most of the rest of the changes we've already seen. The a runs back to o and eventually progresses to this back year.
And let me guess, the s disappears.
Not only that, the first syllable is closed too, so the law of open syllables causes the codas of both to disappear. The loss of s we've seen before, but the k also disappears, and Proto-Slavic syllables couldn't start with two stops. The n disappears as well, but it nasalizes the preceding vowel, giving us the Proto-Slavic pant.
And that's that?
That's all for the ordinal, but don't forget this still means fifth. As one last step, a nominalizing suffix is added to make the word pente, which basically means the fifth one. The Proto-Indo-European word for 6 was suex, maybe.
Maybe.
Well, different branches suggest different words. In Balto-Slavic, Albanian, Germanic and Italic, the word starts with just a s and no w, while in Celtic it begins with sw. Armenian seems to reflect an additional form with a w, but without s at all.
Why is there so much variation?
You mentioned earlier that in Germanic, the word for 4 acquired the initial p under the influence of 5. Since in proto-indo-european the word for 7 began with s, the theory is that that same thing happened to the number 6. One idea is that the original word was wex, ancestor to the Armenian, and that different branches were influenced to different extents. In some, the S of 7 completely replaced the W, while in others it was simply added onto the start.
I see. And you say the Slavic descends from the form which completely replaced the W?
It does, but remember it derives from the ordinal form, sextos. The first change we see to this is satemization, converting the palatovelar into a post-alveolar fricative. This then deleted the s after it. We see the usual shift of O towards Proto-Balto-Slavic, but we also see the initial S assimilate to the fricative in the middle of the word. This medial fricative is shifted to a simple S in Slavic, but in Lithuanian we still see both as post-alveolar in the word šeštas.
I assume from here it's just the straightforward change of that suffix to a back year.
Exactly. We then see the same nominalization as in 5, giving us a final Proto-Slavic šesti. So how did the word develop in Germanic?
The Proto-Germanic word was sex.
I assume that descends from the same form without a w as in Slavic.
Yes, and from there I suspect you can figure out the rest of the changes.
Grimm's law strikes again?
It does, but there's one more step before that. We've discussed that Slavic is a satem branch, where the Indo-European labiovelar and velar stops merged, but the palatovelars stayed distinct. Well, Germanic is a centum branch, where the palatovelars and plain velars merged, and the labiovelars remained separate. This change came a while before Grimm's law, which then shifted the stop to a velar fricative. The Proto-Indo-European word for 7 was septum, and this gave the Proto-Germanic sevun.
I see the similarity, but this one might need some explanation.
That's fair. There's a bit more going on here. So firstly, the Proto-Indo-European word septum underwent a metathesis. That is, the T moved to the end, giving a form sepumt. At some point, the M then assimilated to this T. This change may have occurred a little later, but we'll put it here for simplicity.
Wait a second. Just before we move on, I have a question. The Proto-Germanic form you gave ends in an N, so the T presumably disappears at some point?
That comes a little later, but yes.
So how can we be sure that this is an irregular metathesis, rather than an irregular loss of the T straight away?
Good question. Towards Proto-Germanic, word final nasals were lost and nasalized the preceding vowel. If that T had just disappeared, it would have left a nasal at the end of the word, so we would see a Proto-Germanic sevun. The T being there blocks this from happening, and then gets lost, with the final N the only evidence it was ever there. The U is the vowel regularly inserted before syllabic consonants, and the last change for this numeral is of the P, which passes through Grimm's law to become a bilabial fricative. In early Germanic, as in its ancestor, the accent of this word was on the second syllable, meaning that Werner's law was able to apply to the new fricative. After this point, stress shifted to the first syllable, and this is when that T disappeared, leaving us with the Proto-Germanic form.
So here again, in Slavic, it's the Proto-Indo-European ordinal numeral, septimus, that gave the Proto-Slavic for 7. That p-t-m sequence survived to Proto-Balto-Slavic, but towards Proto-Slavic this becomes b-d-m, with the voicing of the p-t assimilating to the voiced m. Together with the standard changes affecting that final vowel, we get the Proto-Slavic ordinal sebdms.
You've not taken that all away, the S is still there.
Because there is one more thing to discuss.
Let me guess, that cluster in the middle doesn't fit with the law of open syllables.
You're totally right. so a simplification had to be made. And here the result was indeed simpler, but was still a group of consonants, which is doma. Proto-Slavic didn't much like clusters, but it did allow them if they had rising sonority. So they could start with a stop and end with an approximant or nasal. So with this change and the standard loss of s, we get our ordinal numeral for Proto-Slavic as sedm. With the customary nominalization, that gives us the cardinal number sedm. The Indo-European ordinal for 8 had a different ending to surrounding words, being reconstructed as octovos. However, in Balto-Slavic, as well as in the Indo-Iranian branch, we instead see the mos ending of 7th take over. As we evolve towards Slavic, we immediately see satemization apply, which had the effect of turning k into sh in Proto-Balto-Slavic, and ultimately s in Slavic. We also see simplification of the cluster in the middle by the loss of the t.
In Proto-Germanic, the word for 8 was achto.
This one seems quite simple, certainly compared to the last.
It is quite. There are only 4 changes, all of which we've already seen. The first is satemization, with the palatal velar k turning into a plain velar k.
Then Grimm's law,
which turns that k into a fricative.
but not the t.
No, Grimm's law doesn't affect stops if there's another stop or fricative before it.
And the last ones?
The shift of short O to A and movement of the stress to the first syllable. Proto-Germanic notation is slightly different to proto-indo-european, so we write that final W as U, but it's the same thing.
The proto-indo-european word for 9 was neon, right?
Yes, and it gave the Proto-Germanic neun. Again, quite a straightforward one. The first 2 changes were the loss of the laryngeal and the epenthesis of U before the syllabic consonant. We haven't seen it yet, but at the start of a word before a consonant, laryngeals are just dropped, as we can see here. The epenthesis we saw with 7 also applies, where a syllabic consonant has a U added before it and loses its syllabicity.
So this looks done, but I thought you said that word final nasals were lost.
Yes, they were. You may remember that with the number 7, it was the movement of the T from the middle of the word that protected the nasal, but clearly that can't happen here. Instead, we need to look to the word for 10, degemt. Earlier on, we saw the word for 4 borrow its first sound from 5. We have a similar thing here, with the last sound of 10 borrowed over to 9, which by this point probably ended almost identically. This prevented the loss of the N, so neun remained the final Germanic form.
While we're on the topic, do you want to explain how 10 evolved?
Sure, it's quite a simple one. Like in 9, we see the change of syllabic consonants, coming after satemization of the palatal velar. This nasal also assimilates to the stop that follows it. We then see Grimm's law again. In this word there are both a voiced and an unvoiced stop, so we see the one progress to a voiceless stop, and the other progress to a fricative. Finally, as in 7 and 9, the T at the end of the word is lost, leaving us with Proto-Germanic terhun. So, I've been talking for quite a while there. Why don't we go back and look at 9 and 10 in Slavic?
In Proto-Slavic, the numeral for 9 was deventy. Once again, the Slavic numeral evolved on the basis of the proto-indo-european ordinal numeral, which in this case was neuntos. The laryngeal was lost early, disappearing in the same way it did in Germanic. The D at the beginning is common to both Slavic and Baltic languages, and was probably adopted under the influence of the numeral 10, in the same way we've seen a few times now. The syllabic nasal consonant n had an epenthetic vowel added before it, which in Balto-Slavic was I, and we see the regular changes I'm sure you know by now.
Changing the O and deleting the S and N at the end of syllables.
But remember, the N nasalized the vowel. There was also a merger of nasalized vowels, so that nasalized E became a nasalized N. Finally, the W turned into a V, and the nominalizer is added. The evolution of 10 is similar. First, because of the satemization, the K became Sh in Balto-Slavic and eventually S in Proto-Slavic. The nasal loses its syllabicity with the addition of the preceding E, and then nasalizes this vowel, which shifts to E. The end of the word goes through a very recognizable process, with the final Proto-Slavic word being descenti.
And there we have it, the numbers 1 to 10 as they evolved into these two ancient languages. This video is part of a three-way collaboration between myself, RozumRazum, and another channel, Quidnerf. Live right now you can find a video on Quidnerf where he and I talk about loanwords between English and French. And if you head over to Roz's channel, you can find a video with Quidnerf talking about the case systems in the Romance and Slavic languages. If you've enjoyed this video, I highly recommend you check them both out. They are both very, very good channels. I'd just like to thank Roz for joining me in this video.
Thank you, it was a pleasure to work with you.
So, until next time, thank you for watching.